In the year of our Lord, 1095, on a cold November morning in the French town of Clermont, something extraordinary happened. Something that would echo through centuries, reshape civilizations, and spill oceans of blood across 3 continents. Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd gathered in an open field. The cathedral couldn't hold them all, these nobles and knights, these merchants and peasants who had travelled from across France to hear what the Holy Father would say. The air was thick with anticipation, breath misting in the autumn chill. Urban was no ordinary pope. Born Odo of Châtillon to minor French nobility, he understood both the spiritual yearnings and earthly ambitions of his audience. He had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of church politics, surviving the chaos of the investiture controversy. Now, he was about to unleash something far greater than any political maneuver. "My dear brothers in Christ," he began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, "I bring news from the East that should pierce the heart of every Christian soul." What followed was a masterpiece of rhetoric, a speech so powerful that multiple chroniclers would attempt to reconstruct it, each adding their own flourishes. But the core message was clear. Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, the place where Christ had walked and died and risen, was in the hands of the infidel. Urban painted a vivid picture of Eastern Christians suffering under Muslim rule. He spoke of pilgrims robbed and murdered on the roads to the Holy Land. He described churches desecrated, relics destroyed, the very tomb of Christ defiled by the presence of unbelievers. How much of this was true? The reality was far more complex than Urban's black and white portrayal. For 4 centuries, since the Arab conquest of Jerusalem in 638 AD, Christian pilgrims had generally travelled safely to the Holy Land. The Muslim rulers, following Islamic law, had protected people of the book, Christians and Jews who paid a special tax called the jizya. But things had changed in recent decades. The Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam, and fierce warriors from the Central Asian steppes had swept through the Middle East like a storm. In 1071, they had crushed the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert, capturing Emperor Romanos IV himself. Now they controlled most of Anatolia, the heartland of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was actually the Byzantine emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, who had sent envoys to Urban, pleading for help. Alexios was desperate. The empire that had once stretched from Spain to Syria was now reduced to Greece, the Balkans, and a shrinking portion of Anatolia. He needed soldiers, particularly the heavily armoured knights that were the pride of Western Europe. But Urban saw an opportunity far greater than merely helping his Eastern brothers. He saw a chance to unite the fractious nobility of Europe under the banner of the Church. He saw a way to channel the violent energies of a warrior culture toward a holy purpose. Most importantly, he saw a path to healing the Great Schism of 1054 that had split Eastern and Western Christianity. "This land you inhabit," Urban continued, gesturing to the French countryside, "is too narrow for your large population. It scarcely furnishes food enough for its cultivators. Hence, it is that you murder and devour one another, that you wage war, and that very many among you perish in civil strife." This was the masterstroke. Urban wasn't just offering a holy war. He was offering a solution to the chronic problems of European society. The system of primogeniture meant that only the eldest son inherited lands and titles. Younger sons were left to make their own way, often through violence and brigandage. The Peace of God movement had tried to limit this endemic warfare, but with limited success. Now the Pope was offering these restless warriors a chance for glory, wealth, and salvation all at once. "Take the road to the Holy Sepulchre," he thundered. "Rescue that land from a dreadful race, and rule over it yourselves." The crowd's response was electric. "Deus vult," they cried. "God wills it." The phrase would become the battle cry of the Crusades, shouted by knights as they charged into battle. whispered by dying soldiers as they breathed their last. But Urban's most brilliant innovation was yet to come. Drawing on centuries of Christian theology about martyrdom and penance, he made an unprecedented offer. Anyone who took the cross and journeyed to Jerusalem would receive complete remission of sins. It was a spiritual blank check, a guarantee of paradise. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins, Urban proclaimed. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. To understand the power of this promise, we must remember that medieval Europeans lived in constant fear of damnation. The Church taught that even minor sins could result in centuries of torment in purgatory. Now the Pope was offering a way to wipe the slate clean, to guarantee entry into heaven. The response was overwhelming. Nobles began tearing strips from their cloaks, fashioning them into crosses to pin on their chests. The symbol of the cross, which had marked Christians since the time of Constantine, now became the badge of a new kind of warrior, the Crusader, the soldier of Christ. Among those who took the cross that day was Adhemar of Le Puy, whom Urban appointed as papal legate to lead the spiritual side of the expedition. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest nobles in France, pledged his vast resources to the cause. The movement spread like wildfire across Europe, but Urban had unleashed forces beyond his control. He had envisioned an army of disciplined knights under church authority. What he got was something far more chaotic and revolutionary. Peasants, inspired by wandering preachers, began to take the cross in vast numbers. Women demanded the right to join the pilgrimage. Even children caught the fever. The most famous of these popular preachers was Peter the Hermit, a small, dirty man who rode a donkey and claimed to have a letter from heaven authorizing the crusade. Peter's preaching drew enormous crowds. Unlike the nobles who needed months to organize their affairs, these common people were ready to leave immediately. This was something new in European history. For the first time, ordinary people were being offered a chance to participate in a great historical event, to earn salvation through their own actions rather than simply through the intercession of priests and the prayers of monks. The Byzantine princess Anna Komnenos, daughter of Emperor Alexios, would later write with amazement about this mass movement. Full of enthusiasm and ardour, they thronged every highway, and with these warriors came a host of civilians, outnumbering the grains of sand on the seashore or the stars in the heavens, carrying palms and bearing crosses on their shoulders. There were women and children too, who had left their own countries. But beneath the religious fervour, other motivations simmered. Younger sons saw a chance to win lands of their own. Merchants dreamed of Eastern wealth. Criminals sought to escape justice under the protection of the Crusaders' cross. Even some of the great nobles had mixed motives. Bohemond of Taranto, son of the Norman adventurer Robert Guiscard, had spent years fighting against the Byzantines in Italy. Now he saw a chance to carve out a principality in the east. The Islamic world, meanwhile, was almost completely unprepared for what was coming. The great unified caliphates of the past had fragmented into competing emirates and sultanates. The Sunni Abbasid caliph in Baghdad was a powerless figurehead under Seljuk control. The Shia Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo controlled Egypt and had recently lost Jerusalem to the Seljuks. Syria was a patchwork of rival cities and warlords. To the Muslims, the Franks, as they called all Western Europeans, were barely known barbarians from the far edge of the world. The real threats were each other and the occasional Byzantine military expedition. The idea that a vast army would march 3,000 miles from Western Europe to conquer Jerusalem seemed impossible. As 1095 turned to 1096, Europe was in motion. Across France, Germany, Italy, and England, men were selling their lands, mortgaging their futures, and saying goodbye to families they might never see again. The age of the Crusades had begun, though none could imagine that it would last for nearly 2 centuries and transform both Europe and the Middle East forever. The die was cast, the cross was taken, and history held its breath. In the spring of 1096, before the princes and nobles had even finished their preparations, an extraordinary sight appeared on the roads of Europe. Tens of thousands of common people, peasants, minor knights, women, children, even elderly monks, were marching eastward. They carried makeshift crosses, chanted prayers, and followed a most unlikely leader. Peter the Hermit was not an impressive figure. Small, dark, and unkempt, he wore rough clothes and rode a donkey in deliberate imitation of Christ. But when he spoke, something magical happened. His words seemed to burn with divine fire. Crowds wept, nobles knelt, and hardened soldiers took the cross after hearing him preach. Peter claimed to have visited Jerusalem years before, where Christ himself had appeared to him in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, commanding him to lead a great army to free the Holy Land. Whether this vision was real, imagined, or invented, thousands believed it. They called him Peter the Little, Peter the Prophet, even St. Peter reborn. This People's Crusade, as history would name it, was a spontaneous eruption of religious fervor unlike anything Europe had seen. In Cologne, in Trier, in towns across the Rhineland, ordinary people abandoned their homes and joined the growing throng. They sold everything they owned for a few coins to buy food for the journey. Some even freed their serfs and forgave debts, believing the end times were near. A contemporary chronicler, Albert of Aachen, described the scene with wonder. You might see 1,000 strange things among the common people. Some who had no money sewed crosses on their clothes and set out. Others shod their oxen like horses and harnessed them to two-wheeled carts on which they piled their few possessions and small children. But this holy enthusiasm had a dark side. As the crowds moved through the Rhineland, some began to ask a troubling question. Why should we march 3,000 miles to fight the enemies of Christ when we have enemies of Christ right here at home? They were speaking of the Jews. What followed was one of the first great pogroms in European history. In Speyer, in Worms, in Mainz, in Cologne, Jewish communities that had lived peacefully for centuries were suddenly under attack. The crusading mobs offered them a choice: convert to Christianity or die. The Jewish chronicles of these events make for heartbreaking reading. In Mainz, over 1,000 Jews took refuge in the palace of Archbishop Ruthard, who tried to protect them. But the mob broke through. Faced with forced conversion, many chose martyrdom. Mothers killed their own children rather than see them baptized. Fathers slaughtered their families and then themselves, dying with the Shema on their lips. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. One Jewish chronicler wrote, Has the like of this been heard or seen? Ask and see. Did ever a people hear of such a thing? Christians walk to the slaughter, as to a wedding. But we go to ours as sheep to slaughter, tested by the Lord to see if we love him with all our heart and all our soul. Count Emicho of Flonheim, a minor German noble who led some of the worst massacres, claimed that a cross had miraculously appeared on his flesh, marking him as God's chosen instrument. His followers believed that converting or killing all Jews was necessary to bring about the second coming of Christ. This was not what Pope Urban had preached, but the forces he had unleashed were beyond anyone's control. Peter the Hermit himself seems to have tried to prevent the worst excesses, but his followers were drunk on apocalyptic fervor. As they moved eastward through Hungary, their behavior grew worse. They stole food from local Christians, claiming it was their right as holy warriors. When Hungarian forces tried to stop them, they fought back, burning villages and killing anyone who opposed them. By the time the People's Crusade reached Constantinople in August of 1096, Emperor Alexios was horrified. This was not the disciplined force of Western knights he had requested. This was a hungry, unruly mob of perhaps 40,000 people, many of them non-combatants. Anna Komnenos, the emperor's daughter, later described them with aristocratic disdain. A certain Frankish Peter, called the Hermit, led a numberless host of common people, men and women who had left their homes, some with wagons, others on foot. They were more numerous than the sands of the seashore or the stars of heaven. Each bore a cross on his shoulder. Alexios faced a dilemma. He couldn't feed this vast crowd indefinitely, but he also couldn't simply turn them away. They were, after all, fellow Christians who had come to help fight the Turks. His solution was pragmatic, but ultimately fatal. He ferried them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as quickly as possible, warning them to wait for the main crusading armies before advancing. They didn't listen. Drunk on early successes against lightly defended villages, the People's Crusade split into competing groups. French and German contingents raided separately, each trying to outdo the other in capturing booty. They tortured and killed Turkish civilians with the same brutality they had shown to Jews in the Rhineland. The Turkish response was swift and devastating. Kilij Arslan, the young Seljuk Sultan of Rum, had initially dismissed reports of the Frankish invasion. These ragged pilgrims hardly seemed a threat, but when they began attacking his territory, he gathered his forces. On October 21st, 1096, near the village of Sivato, the Turkish army fell upon the People's Crusade. It was not a battle but a massacre. The Crusaders, mostly untrained peasants with improvised weapons, were cut down by mounted archers who struck from a distance, never allowing them to close for hand-to-hand combat. A handful of survivors made it back to a fortified camp by the sea, where they held out until Byzantine ships rescued them. Of the tens of thousands who had crossed into Asia, only about 3,000 survived. The road to Sivato was littered with bones that would still be visible years later when the main crusading armies passed by. Peter the Hermit himself survived, having been in Constantinople when the disaster struck. He would attach himself to the prince's armies and eventually see Jerusalem. But the movement he had inspired was dead, drowned in blood before it could reach the Holy Land. The failure of the People's Crusade taught harsh lessons. Holy enthusiasm was not enough. Miracles would not replace military discipline. The Turks were not the weak, cowardly enemies that propaganda had portrayed. This would be a long, hard war, requiring professional soldiers and careful planning. But perhaps the most important lesson was one that few learned at the time. Religious war, once unleashed, was almost impossible to control. The same fervor that inspired men to march thousands of miles for their faith could also inspire them to slaughter their neighbours. The cross that was meant to unite Christendom had become a symbol of division and death. As autumn turned to winter in 1096, the real First Crusade was just beginning. The great nobles of Europe, men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and Robert of Normandy, were finally ready to march. They had learned from Peter's failure. Their armies were disciplined, well-equipped, and led by experienced commanders. But they would face challenges that made the People's Crusade look like a pleasant pilgrimage. The road to Jerusalem led through some of the harshest terrain on earth, past cities defended by determined enemies, through lands where food and water were scarce, and disease was rampant. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios watched their approach with mixed feelings. These were the reinforcements he had requested, but they were also potential conquerors. Each prince commanded forces that could threaten Constantinople itself. Managing them would require all his diplomatic skill. The Muslim world, shocked by the savagery of the People's Crusade, but reassured by its failure, began to take the Frankish threat more seriously. Messages flew between Damascus and Cairo, between Baghdad and Aleppo. The Christians were coming in force this time. The real war for the Holy Land was about to begin. And in the West, those who had taken the cross said their final farewells. Knights confessed their sins and received communion. Wives and mothers wept. Children too young to understand wondered why their fathers were leaving. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres, who would march with the Crusaders, captured the pain of these partings. Oh, what grief there was, what sighs, what weeping, what lamentation among friends when husband left wife so dear to him, his children, and all his possessions, father and mother, brother and sister, and all his other relatives. But grief was mixed with exultation. They were setting out on the greatest adventure of their age, a holy pilgrimage and a just war combined. God himself had called them to this task. Surely he would not abandon them on the long road ahead. The march of madness was over. The march of armies had begun. By the spring of 1097, Constantinople witnessed a sight unseen for centuries. The greatest armies of Western Europe were camped outside its massive walls, their tents spreading like a vast city of canvas and wood. Emperor Alexios watched from the palace windows with deep unease. He had asked for mercenaries. What he got were independent armies, each following its own proud leader, each with its own ambitions. The first to arrive had been Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France, who styled himself Hugh the Great. After being shipwrecked on the Albanian coast and rescued by Byzantine forces, Hugh found himself less a guest than a polite prisoner until he swore an oath of loyalty to the emperor. This would set the pattern for all who followed. Godfrey of Bouillon came next, leading an army from Lorraine. Tall, fair-haired, deeply religious, Godfrey had sold his entire duchy to finance his crusade. He would accept no earthly reward, he declared, save the privilege of praying at Christ's tomb. But when Alexios demanded he swear that the same oath as Hugh, Godfrey balked. Why should he, a duke in his own right, bow to this Greek emperor? For months, a tense standoff developed. Alexios cut off food supplies to force compliance. Godfrey's men raided the suburbs. In response, small skirmishes broke out between Crusaders and imperial troops. It seemed the great expedition might end in Christians fighting Christians before a single Muslim had been engaged. Anna Komnenos, watching from the palace, later wrote with barely concealed contempt, "The Frankish counts are brazen-faced, violent men, money grubbers and totally shameless. They're all unbearably boastful, and anything that is said to them or any attempt to discipline them is taken as a mortal insult." But Alexios was a master of diplomacy. Through a mixture of threats, bribes and promises, he won over each leader in turn. Godfrey eventually swore the oath after Alexios demonstrated Byzantine military might by having his troops shoot arrows over the Crusader camp, each one landing precisely where intended. The message was clear: cooperate or face the empire's full strength. Bohemond of Taranto proved easier to manage. This Norman adventurer, son of Robert Guiscard, who had terrorized Byzantine Italy, saw opportunity where others saw humiliation. He swore the oath eagerly, hoping to be named commander of all imperial forces in Asia. His ambition was naked, but at least it was predictable. Raymond of Toulouse, the oldest and wealthiest of the crusading princes, proved most stubborn. This grizzled veteran of wars against Spanish Muslims refused to swear full homage, agreeing only to a modified oath promising not to harm imperial interests. Alexios, recognizing he had pushed as far as he could, accepted. By May of 1097, the armies had crossed into Asia Minor. The combined force numbered perhaps 35,000 fighting men, plus thousands more non-combatants. It was the largest Western European army assembled since Charlemagne, a steel-clad tide rolling toward the Holy Land. Their first target was Nicaea, capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the city where the Nicene Creed had been formulated, where Constantine had presided over the first great council of the Christian Church, was now the seat of Muslim power in Anatolia. Its walls were formidable, its garrison strong, its symbolic importance immense. The siege began in May. For the Crusaders, it was a harsh introduction to Eastern warfare. The Turks were not the static defenders they had expected. Sultan Kilij Arslan, who had destroyed the People's Crusade so easily, now faced a real military threat. His mounted archers harassed the besiegers constantly, appearing from nowhere to loose clouds of arrows before vanishing into the hills. One crusader wrote home, "These Turks use a diabolic art of war. They shoot arrows while fleeing, turning in their saddles like demons. Our knights in heavy armour cannot catch them, and our foot soldiers are helpless against their mounted attacks." But the Crusaders adapted. They learned to coordinate infantry and cavalry, to use their crossbows to outrange Turkish bows, to build siege engines that could batter even Nicaea's mighty walls. Most importantly, they learned to work together. French, Norman, German, and Italian contingents slowly forged themselves into a unified army. The siege dragged on for weeks. Food ran short, disease spread through the camps. The summer heat of Anatolia, so different from cool European forests, tormented men in heavy armour, but religious fervor sustained them. Priests held daily services. Visions and miracles were reported. A shower of meteorites was interpreted as a sign of God's favour. Then, just as the walls began to crack under bombardment, the Crusaders woke to see Byzantine flags flying over Nicaea. Alexios had secretly negotiated the city's surrender during the night. The garrison and population would be spared, their property protected, in exchange for returning to imperial control. The Crusaders were furious. They had been denied their plunder, their chance for vengeance against the infidel. But Alexios had what he wanted, a key city returned to the empire without destruction. It was a reminder that Byzantine and Crusader goals were not always aligned. From Nicaea, the army marched southeast into the Anatolian plateau. Now the real suffering began. This was some of the harshest terrain on earth, a high desert of scorching days and freezing nights. Water sources were scarce and often poisoned by retreating Turks. The heavily armoured knights, pride of European warfare, found their strength sapped by heat and thirst. On July 1st, 1097, near the village of Dorileum, Kilij Arslan struck. The Turkish army, perhaps 50,000 strong, fell upon the Crusader vanguard led by Bohemond. For hours the Normans fought desperately, forming a defensive circle while mounted archers poured arrows into their ranks. Robert of Normandy, son of William the Conqueror, described the battle. "They came upon us like a whirlwind, surrounding us on all sides, shooting arrows from an incredible distance. We could not fight them as we fight in our own lands. They would not stand and face us, but fled when we charged, all the while shooting behind them." Just when it seemed Bohemond's force would be overwhelmed, the main Crusader army arrived. Godfrey of Bouillon led a massive charge that smashed into the Turkish flank. Raymond of Toulouse attacked from another direction. Caught between multiple forces, the Turkish army broke and fled. Dorileum was the Crusaders' first great victory, and it changed everything. The myth of Turkish invincibility was shattered. More importantly, the various contingents had fought as one army, saving each other from destruction. They were no longer French or Norman or Italian. They were Crusaders, brothers in arms, but the march across Anatolia tested that brotherhood to its limits. The Turks adopted scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and poisoning wells. Horses died by the hundreds. Knights were reduced to riding oxen or walking in armour. The elderly and sick were left by the roadside. Women gave birth on the march, often losing their infants to heat and disease. One chronicler wrote, "You would see proud knights reduced to beggars, selling their arms for bread. Noble ladies walked barefoot over burning sand. The army that had left Constantinople in splendour now looked like a procession of ghosts. Yet they pressed on, driven by faith and the promise of Jerusalem. When they reached the Christian lands of Armenian Cilicia, they were welcomed as liberators. The Armenian princes, long oppressed by both Byzantines and Turks, provided food, guides, and information about the road ahead. It was here that the first cracks in Crusader unity appeared. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's younger brother, broke away from the main army with a small force. Marching east to Edessa, he manoeuvred himself into position as heir to the elderly Armenian ruler. When the old prince died under suspicious circumstances, Baldwin became Count of Edessa, the first Crusader state. Meanwhile, the main army faced its greatest challenge yet, Antioch, the mighty city that guarded the road to Syria. Its walls stretched for miles, studded with 400 towers. Its garrison was strong, its supplies plentiful. Taking it would require a siege of unprecedented scale. As October 1097 dawned, the Crusaders made camp before Antioch's walls. They had marched 2,000 miles, fought desperate battles, survived unimaginable hardships, but their greatest trials lay ahead. The city that had once been the birthplace of the word Christian would test their faith, their unity, and their will to continue. Behind those walls, the Turkish governor, Yagi Sian, watched and waited. He had sent messages throughout the Muslim world. The Franks are here in force. The jihad must begin, or all Syria will fall. Help was coming, he knew. The question was whether it would arrive before the Crusaders found a way through his impregnable walls. The stage was set for one of the longest, bloodiest sieges in medieval history. Before it ended, heroes would become villains. Faith would wrestle with desperation, and the crusade would nearly destroy itself. Antioch would make or break the march to Jerusalem. For 8 months, the Crusaders sat before the walls of Antioch like beggars at a rich man's gate. 8 months of hunger, disease, desperation, and death. 8 months that would transform heroes into cannibals and saints into cynics. If Jerusalem was the dream, Antioch was the nightmare that nearly ended it all. The city mocked them with its strength. Its walls, built by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian and improved by generations of Arab engineers, stretched for 12 miles around mountain slopes and river valleys. The Crusaders, perhaps 20,000 fighting men by now, couldn't even surround it properly. Supplies flowed in through gates they couldn't reach. Messages went out calling for relief armies from Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul. Winter came early in 1097, and it was merciless. Rain turned the camps into swamps. Tents rotted, armor rusted. Men who had survived the desert heat of Anatolia now died of cold in their sleep. The price of food soared until a single egg cost more than a peasant earned in a month. Knights ate their war horses. Common soldiers ate rats, dogs, leather straps, anything that might fill their bellies. Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest crusaders, wrote to his wife, Adela, "Before Antioch we suffer such tribulation and distress as I cannot describe. Many of our men have died of hunger, despite all our wealth. A loaf of bread costs a bezant. I am ruined, having spent everything on food for my men." The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir later recorded what his sources told him. The Franks suffered terribly. They ate carrion and leaves. Their nobles could be seen wandering the camps, begging for scraps. Some were reduced to cannibalism, eating the flesh of dead Turks after battles. This last detail, shocking as it sounds, appears in multiple sources. During a particularly desperate period, some crusaders at the town of Ma'ara would indeed resort to eating enemy dead. The trauma of Antioch drove men to acts they would never have imagined in their comfortable European homes. Inside the city, Yagi Sian played a careful game. He knew help was coming, but didn't know when. His garrison was strong but outnumbered, so he used psychological warfare, allowing his men to taunt the Crusaders from the walls, displaying food and treasure the starving Christians couldn't reach. Worse for the Crusaders, they faced a two-front war. Ridwan of Aleppo and Dukak of Damascus, normally bitter rivals, put aside their differences to send relief forces. The Crusaders found themselves fighting off attacks from outside while maintaining their siege. Each battle depleted their strength. Each victory was Pyrrhic. Desertion became epidemic. Peter the Hermit himself, the man whose preaching had launched the People's Crusade, tried to flee but was caught and brought back in disgrace. Stephen of Blois, claiming illness, abandoned the siege entirely, carrying back to Europe tales of inevitable defeat. Even William the Conqueror's son, Robert of Normandy, considered leaving. It was Bohemond who saved them, through treachery that would have made his Norman ancestors proud. The ambitious prince had been secretly negotiating with a tower commander named Firouz, an Armenian Christian who had converted to Islam but nursed secret grievances against Yaghi Sian. The price of betrayal was steep. Bohemond would get Antioch for himself if his plan succeeded. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Firouz opened his section of the walls. Bohemond's men scaled the towers in darkness, killing the guards silently. By dawn, Crusader banners flew over Antioch. The garrison caught, completely by surprise, fled or died in the streets. The 8-month siege was over. But liberation became massacre. 8 months of suffering demanded payment in blood. The Crusaders rampaged through Antioch, killing Muslims and Christians alike in their fury. Yaghi Sian fled, but was caught and beheaded by Armenian peasants. His head was brought to the Crusaders as a trophy. Raymond of Aguilé, a priest who witnessed the sack, wrote with disturbing enthusiasm, "In the streets, in the houses, in the temples, on the rooftops, there was nothing but killing. One could not walk without stepping on corpses. By evening, the city was carpeted with dead bodies." The Crusaders had barely finished their slaughter when terrible news arrived. Kerboga, the fearsome governor of Mosul, was approaching with the largest Muslim army yet assembled, perhaps 75,000 men. The besiegers were about to become the besieged. Within days, Kerboga's army surrounded Antioch. The Crusaders were trapped in a city they had just devastated, with little food and many enemies among the surviving population. Morale collapsed utterly. Men threw themselves from the walls rather than face slow starvation. Others converted to Islam hoping for mercy. It was then in their darkest hour that a miracle occurred. Or was it a fraud? A poor pilgrim named Peter Bartholomew claimed that St. Andrew had appeared to him in a vision, revealing that the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side, was buried beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral. The leaders were sceptical. Adhemar of Le Puy, the papal legate, openly doubted, but Raymond of Toulouse, desperate for anything that might restore morale, ordered excavations. After a day of digging, found nothing, Peter Bartholomew jumped into the pit himself and emerged clutching a piece of ancient iron. Real or fake, the effect was electric. The Holy Lance became a rallying point, proof that God had not abandoned them. Men who had been ready to surrender now demanded to fight. Even the skeptics kept quiet, recognizing that belief might be more important than truth. On June 28th, the Crusaders did the impossible. Starving, outnumbered 3-1, they opened the gates and marched out to battle. They arranged themselves in divisions, each following a great lord's banner, with the Holy Lance carried at the fore. Kerboga, confident in his numbers, allowed them to deploy fully before attacking. It was a fatal mistake. The Crusaders, driven by religious ecstasy and desperation, fought like men possessed. When Kerboga's coalition began to waver, with emirs abandoning the field due to internal rivalries, the Muslim army collapsed. The victory was so complete, so unexpected, that many saw it as divine intervention. Angels had been seen fighting alongside the Crusaders, they claimed. Saints had appeared in the sky. God himself had granted victory to his chosen warriors. But the aftermath was bitter. The princes immediately fell to quarrelling over who should rule Antioch. Bohemond claimed it by right of conquest and prior agreement. Raymond insisted it should be returned to Emperor Alexios. The dispute paralysed the crusade for months. Meanwhile, a plague swept through the army, killing thousands who had survived battle and siege. Among the dead was Adhemar of Le Puy, the one leader everyone respected. Without his moderating influence, the divisions grew worse. The common soldiers grew restless. They had not marched thousands of miles to see their leaders become petty warlords. In a remarkable display of popular pressure, they forced the princes to resume the march to Jerusalem. But the army that left Antioch in January 1099 was a shadow of what had entered Asia Minor. Perhaps 12,000 fighting men remained, plus a ragged tale of pilgrims and camp followers. They had learned hard lessons about Eastern warfare, about the price of their quest. The naive enthusiasm of Clermont was gone, replaced by grim determination. As they marched south along the Syrian coast, Muslim resistance melted away. The emirs of Shaizar, Homs and Tripoli, terrified by what had happened at Antioch, offered tribute and safe passage. They wanted these dangerous fanatics gone, not martyred on their walls. The Crusaders were happy to accept. They were tired of siege warfare, tired of politics, tired of everything but their original goal. Jerusalem beckoned, now only weeks away. The city they had dreamed of, prayed for, suffered for, was finally within reach. Behind them, Antioch remained in Bohemon's hands, the second Crusader state after Baldwin's Edessa. The Norman adventurer had achieved his ambition, trading Jerusalem for earthly power. But for the rest, the pilgrimage continued. They were fewer now, harder, perhaps wiser. The warriors who approached Jerusalem in the summer of 1099 were not the same men who had taken the cross at Clermont. They had been tempered in the forge of Antioch, transformed by suffering into something new, the first generation of Crusaders, men who had learned that faith alone was not enough, that God's will required human blood and iron to enforce. The holy city awaited, and with it the climax of their long journey and the birth of a legend that would echo through centuries. On the morning of June 7, 1099, a Provençal knight named Gaston climbed a hill called Montchoix and saw what thousands had died to reach. "Jerusalem," he cried, and the word rippled back through the ragged column like a prayer finally answered. Men who had marched in grim silence for days fell to their knees. Hardened warriors wept like children. Some kissed the ground. Others raised their arms to heaven, praising God for allowing them to live to see this moment. Jerusalem the golden, Jerusalem the holy, Jerusalem the centre of the world lay before them, its limestone walls glowing in the morning sun. After 3 years of unimaginable hardship, they had reached the city where Christ had walked, taught, died and risen. Every suffering along the way, every friend lost, every temptation overcome, had led to this. But between the Crusaders and their goal stood walls 30 feet high, defended by a capable garrison under Iftikhar ad-Dawla, the Fatimid governor. The Egyptian Fatimids had retaken Jerusalem from the Seljuks just a year before, and they had no intention of surrendering it to these Frankish barbarians. The Crusaders numbered fewer than 1,300 knights and 12,000 foot soldiers. Inside Jerusalem waited a garrison of similar size, plus thousands of armed citizens. The Christians and Jews of the city had been expelled, Iftikhar fearing they might aid their co-religionists. The wells outside the walls had been poisoned. The countryside had been stripped of supplies. It should have been another Antioch, another grinding siege that would destroy the Crusaders through attrition. But these men were beyond ordinary calculation now. They had not come so far to fail, within sight of their goal. Jerusalem would fall, they swore, or they would die beneath its walls. The first assault came on June 13th, driven more by enthusiasm than strategy. Without siege engines, without ladders tall enough to reach the battlements, the Crusaders tried to take the city by faith alone. They were slaughtered. Boiling oil, Greek fire, and storms of arrows met every attempt to scale the walls. Among those watching was Tancred, Bohemon's nephew, who had carved out a domain around the Sea of Galilee. He later told a chronicler, "We attacked like madmen, believing God would grant us victory, as he had at Antioch. But God teaches harsh lessons. Faith without preparation is presumption." The failure shocked them into practicality. They needed wood for siege engines, but the area around Jerusalem was nearly treeless. Then, as if by providence, Genoese ships arrived at Jaffa, carrying supplies and, more importantly, skilled engineers. The Crusaders dismantled the ships and hauled the timber 40 miles to Jerusalem. For 3 weeks they laboured in the scorching heat of a Judean summer. 2 massive siege towers rose, along with catapults and battering rams. The work was torment. The sun beat down mercilessly. Water was scarce and had to be carried from distant springs under constant threat of Muslim raids. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. The Muslim defenders watched these preparations with growing alarm. They reinforced the sections of wall where the towers would strike. They prepared their own engines. Most disturbing to the Crusaders, they would parade holy crosses on the walls and defile them, knowing the psychological impact on their enemies. Then came another vision, or perhaps a moment of strategic genius disguised as divine inspiration. A hermit claimed that God had spoken to him. The Crusaders must purify themselves through penance, then march barefoot around Jerusalem as Joshua had circled Jericho. On the 7th day, the walls would fall. On July 8th, the entire Crusader army, from the greatest prince to the lowliest pilgrim, removed their shoes and walked in procession around the city. The Muslims jeered from the walls, but the Crusaders marched in silence, priests at their head carrying relics and crosses. They climbed the Mount of Olives, where Christ had ascended to heaven, and there Peter the hermit preached with all his old fire. The ritual served its purpose. It unified the army, reminding them why they had come. It also convinced the defenders that these Franks were religious fanatics who would never give up. Some of the garrison's mercenaries began to slip away, sensing inevitable defeat. The final assault began on the night of July 13th. The 2 great siege towers, one commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon, the other by Raymond of Toulouse, rolled toward different sections of the wall. The fighting was apocalyptic. Greek fire turned men into human torches. Stones from catapults crushed attackers and defenders alike. The air filled with smoke, screams, and the stench of burning flesh. For 2 days the battle raged. Raymond's tower became stuck, unable to breach the southern walls. But Godfrey, fighting at the northern wall near Herod's Gate, managed to bridge the gap. As July 15th dawned, Godfrey himself stood on the walls of Jerusalem, his banner planted where none thought it could be. The defence crumbled with shocking speed. As Crusaders poured over the walls, the garrison fled to the Temple Mount, Islam's 3rd holiest site after Mecca and Medina. Others took refuge in the Tower of David, where Iftikhar ad-Dawla made his last stand. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Crusades. The Crusaders, driven by 3 years of suffering and religious hatred, unleashed a massacre that shocked even medieval sensibilities. Muslims were cut down wherever they were found. Those who fled to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, hoping for sanctuary, were slaughtered, until, as Raymond of Aguilera wrote with disturbing pride, men rode in blood up to their knees in bridle reins. The Jewish population, who had taken no part in the fighting, fled to their synagogues. The Crusaders set the buildings ablaze, singing Christian hymns as the people inside burned alive. The massacre continued for 3 days. Contemporary Muslim sources claimed 70,000 were killed, though modern historians suggest the number was closer to 3,000, still a horrific toll. Even some Crusaders were disturbed by the slaughter. Tancred had given his protection to a group of Muslims on the Temple Mount, but other Crusaders killed them anyway, staining his honour. The Provençal chronicler Raymond of Aguilera, despite his earlier bloodthirsty accounts, admitted it was impossible to look upon the vast numbers of slain without horror. Everywhere lay fragments of human bodies, and the very ground was covered with the blood of the slain. Only Iftikhar ad-Dawla and his personal guard were spared, ransomed for a massive sum. As he left Jerusalem, he reportedly told Raymond of Toulouse, "You have won this round, but this is not the end. Islam has a long memory." On July 22nd, the Crusaders held a solemn procession to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. These same men, who had waded through blood, now walked barefoot as penitents, weeping with joy as they prayed at Christ's tomb. The contradiction seemed lost on them. In their minds, they had liberated the holy city from infidel pollution. The massacre was God's judgment on his enemies. The question of who should rule Jerusalem sparked immediate controversy. Raymond of Toulouse, the wealthiest and most experienced prince, seemed the obvious choice, but when offered a crown, he reportedly said, "I will not wear a crown of gold where Christ wore a crown of thorns." Whether this was genuine piety or political calculation, knowing others would oppose him, the refusal opened the door for Godfrey of Bouillon. On July 22nd, Godfrey was elected ruler, though he refused the title of king, calling himself instead Advocatus Sancti Sepulchri, defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Most of the Crusaders, their vow fulfilled, prepared to return home. They had prayed at the Holy Sepulchre, bathed in the Jordan River, taken palm fronds from Jericho. The pilgrimage was complete. Of the hundreds of thousands who had taken the cross, perhaps only 2,000 knights, and twice that many infantry, remained to defend the new kingdom. But the Muslim world was already stirring. The loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves from Baghdad to Cairo. The poet Al-Abiwadi captured the Muslim anguish. The unbelievers have conquered Jerusalem. Where are the swords of Islam? Where is the faith of those who claim to serve Allah? We have become a joke to our enemies. The Crusaders had won their great prize, but holding it would prove far harder than taking it. They controlled a few coastal cities and a narrow corridor to Jerusalem, surrounded by a sea of hostile powers. Their kingdom was a dagger thrust into the heart of Islam, and Islam would not forget. As Godfrey of Bouillon stood in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that first Christmas of Frankish rule, he might have reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him there. From Pope Urban's speech at Clermont to this moment was only 4 years, but they had been years that changed the world. The First Crusade was over. The age of the Crusader States had begun, and with it, nearly 2 centuries of war, coexistence, cultural exchange, and bitter conflict that would transform both East and West forever. Jerusalem was Christian again, but at what cost and for how long? In the year 1100, barely 6 months after the conquest of Jerusalem, Godfrey of Bouillon lay dying. The man who had refused a crown of gold had ruled for less than a year, and already the kingdom of Jerusalem faced extinction. Muslim armies probed its borders. The few thousand Franks who remained were outnumbered 100 to 1. It seemed the great crusade might end with a whimper, its conquests swept away like sandcastles before the tide. But something extraordinary happened. Against all odds, against all logic, the Crusader States not only survived, but thrived. For nearly 2 centuries, a Frankish society would flourish in the Levant, creating a unique civilization that was neither wholly Western nor Eastern, but something new under the sun. They called it Outre-mer, the land beyond the sea. 4 major states emerged from the chaos of conquest: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the counties of Edessa and Tripoli. Each was ruled by Frankish nobles, but their subjects were overwhelmingly Muslim and Eastern Christian. It was an impossible arrangement that somehow worked. Baldwin of Boulogne, Godfrey's brother, rushed from Edessa to claim the throne of Jerusalem. Unlike Godfrey, he had no qualms about wearing a crown. On Christmas Day, 1100, he was crowned King Baldwin I in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, establishing a dynasty that would endure for nearly a century. Baldwin was everything a Crusader king needed to be: warrior, diplomat, and pragmatist. He understood that the Franks could not rule through force alone. They were too few, their enemies too many. Survival required adaptation, compromise, and above all, the creation of a functioning state. The transformation was remarkable. Frankish nobles who had left Europe as religious warriors became Oriental potentates. They learned Arabic, employed Muslim physicians, and relaxed in steam baths. Their wives wore silk and pearls, shocking new pilgrims with their adoption of Eastern fashions. Some even used makeup and perfume, scandalizing churchmen who saw moral decay in every comfort. Fulcher of Chartres, who had marched with the First Crusade and settled in Jerusalem, wrote with wonder, "We who are Occidentals have now become Orientals. He who was a Roman or a Frank has in this land been made into a Galilean or a Palestinian. We have already forgotten the places of our birth." The key to Outremer's survival was its policy of accommodation. Unlike the massacre that marked Jerusalem's conquest, the Crusader States generally allowed religious freedom to their Muslim and Jewish subjects. They paid higher taxes than Christians, but could practice their faith, maintain their own courts for religious matters, and even serve in the military. This pragmatism shocked new arrivals from Europe. Usama ibn Munkid, a Muslim nobleman who had many Frankish friends, recorded an illuminating incident. He was praying in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Templars had converted to their headquarters but still allowed Muslim prayer, when a newly arrived Frank attacked him for not facing east. The Templars immediately intervened, apologizing and explaining that this Frank was fresh from Europe and didn't understand local customs. Trade flourished in this unlikely kingdom. Italian merchants established quarters in every coastal city. Acre became one of the great ports of the Mediterranean, where eastern spices met western silver. Sugar plantations, a new crop for Europeans, enriched noble families. The gold basint of Jerusalem became a trusted currency from London to Cairo, but this prosperity rested on military might, and here the Crusader States developed something revolutionary: the military orders. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims, evolved into a standing army of warrior monks. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but their corporate wealth was immense. Their castles dotted the landscape like stone sentinels. The Hospitallers followed a similar path, transforming from a charitable order caring for sick pilgrims into a military force. These orders solved a critical problem. They provided permanent garrisons in a land where most knights returned to Europe after their pilgrimage. A Templar or Hospitaller would spend decades in Outremer, becoming expert in local warfare and politics. Their castles were marvels of military architecture. Crac des Chevaliers, the Hospitaller fortress in Syria, could house 2,000 men and withstand years of siege. These weren't just fortifications, but centres of administration, controlling vast agricultural estates worked by Muslim peasants under Frankish oversight. The nobility of Outremer developed its own character, distinct from European feudalism. The High Court of Jerusalem, where the king was theoretically just first among equals, became famous for its legal sophistication. The Assizes of Jerusalem, their law code, balanced Frankish custom with local necessity. Women in Outremer enjoyed freedoms unknown in Europe. They could inherit fiefs, rule in their own right, and choose their husbands after widowhood. Queen Melisenda, who ruled Jerusalem from 1131 to 1153, was one of the most powerful monarchs of her age, male or female. She patronized arts and architecture, leaving churches and scripturias that blended Byzantine, Islamic, and Western styles. This cultural fusion produced remarkable art. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was rebuilt in Romanesque style, but decorated with Byzantine mosaics and Islamic geometric patterns. Illuminated manuscripts from Jerusalem's scriptorium showed Virgin Marys with almond eyes and Christ figures that seemed to float in Byzantine golden space. Daily life in Outremer had a dreamlike quality for European visitors. Frankish lords lived in houses with courtyards and fountains. copying Muslim architecture suited to the climate. They ate dates and pomegranates, drank sherbet cooled with snow from Mount Lebanon, and enjoyed entertainment from Muslim musicians and dancers. The chronicler William of Tyre, born in Jerusalem to a Frankish family, captured this hybrid world. In our kingdom, Franks and Syrians live side by side. In the markets you hear French, Arabic, Greek and Armenian. Our children grow up speaking multiple tongues as naturally as breathing. Some say we have forgotten our roots, but I say we have grown new ones. Medicine in Outremer showed this cultural synthesis at its best. Frankish lords preferred Muslim and Jewish physicians, trusting their superior knowledge. The great hospital of the Knights of St. John in Jerusalem could accommodate 2,000 patients, offering care that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. They had separate wards for different diseases, a pharmacy, and even a mental health section. But beneath this prosperous surface, tension simmered. The Polani, as the native-born Franks were called, often clashed with new crusaders who arrived full of zeal and ignorance. These newcomers couldn't understand why their co-religionists lived peacefully with Muslims, why they negotiated instead of fighting, why they seemed more interested in sugar profits than holy war. The military orders, despite their crucial role, became states within states, answering only to the Pope. Their wealth and arrogance bred resentment. The Templars' banking network made them richer than many kings. Their grand masters negotiated with Muslim leaders as equals, sometimes undermining royal policy. Geography was Outremer's eternal challenge. The Crusader States formed a thin strip along the coast, rarely extending more than 50 miles inland. They were islands of Frankish rule in an Islamic sea, connected by vulnerable roads through hostile territory. A castle might control its immediate area, but between castles lay lands where any Christian travelled at mortal risk. The Muslims called the Franks Franj, seeing them initially as just another player in the complex politics of the region. Damascus might ally with Jerusalem against Aleppo. Egyptian Fatimids and Syrian Seljuks hated each other more than they hated the Christians. This disunity gave Outremer breathing space to establish itself. But that breathing space was ending. In the Muslim courts of Aleppo and Damascus, a new generation of leaders was emerging. They had grown up with the Frankish presence, studied their weaknesses, and dreamed of jihad to reclaim the lost territories. The accommodations that made Outremer possible also made it vulnerable. As the 12th century progressed, the balance was shifting. The Franks had built something remarkable, a functioning, multi-religious, multicultural state in an age of religious absolutism. But it was built on foundations of sand. When united Muslim power finally arose, would the dream of Outremer prove strong enough to survive? The Crusader States were entering their golden age, but golden ages, by definition, don't last forever. The same adaptability that ensured their survival might also prove their downfall, for in becoming Eastern, had they lost the fierce faith that brought them there? In learning to live with Islam, had they forgotten how to fight it? These questions would soon be answered in blood and fire. In the pre-dawn darkness of Christmas Eve, 1144, Imad ad-Din Zengi stood before the walls of Edessa. The Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo was not a man given to sentiment, but even he felt the weight of this moment. For 45 years, the Franks had held this ancient city. Tonight, that would end. Zengi was something new in the Islamic world, a leader who understood that defeating the Crusaders required more than military might. It required unity, discipline, and above all, the revival of jihad as a motivating force. While the Franks had been building their kingdom, he had been methodically conquering Muslim rivals, forging a power base that could challenge the invaders. The siege of Edessa lasted just 4 weeks. On Christmas Eve, as the Frankish population prepared to celebrate Christ's birth, Zengi's sappers brought down a section of wall. His troops poured through, and Count Jocelyn II's worst nightmare became reality. He wasn't even in the city, having left to campaign elsewhere, trusting in Edessa's famous walls. The fall of Edessa sent shockwaves through both Christian and Muslim worlds. For the Franks, it was the first major territorial loss, proof that their kingdoms were not invincible. For Muslims, it was the first sweet taste of reconquest, evidence that the Franks could be driven back into the sea. Hugh, Archbishop of Edessa, sent a desperate letter to Pope Eugene III. The infidels have taken the shield of Christianity in the east. If Edessa can fall, what city is safe? The wolves circle our flock, and we are too few shepherds to protect them all. The Pope's response would launch the Second Crusade, but that disaster lay in the future. For now, the Muslim world celebrated. Poets composed verses praising Zengi as the pillar of faith and sword of Islam. More importantly, his success inspired imitators. The idea of jihad against the Franks, dormant for decades, stirred to life. But Zengi himself wouldn't live to see the full fruits of his victory. In 1146, one of his own Mamluks murdered him while he slept, reportedly over a personal grudge. The nascent Muslim unity might have collapsed there, but Zengi had sired a son who would prove even more formidable, Nur ad-Din. Where Zengi had been brutal and pragmatic, Nur ad-Din added genuine religious devotion to the mix. Tall, dark-skinned, with a carefully groomed beard, he looked the part of an Islamic hero. More importantly, he lived it. He built mosques and madrasas, patronized scholars, and lived simply despite his vast wealth. William of Tyre, the great chronicler of the Crusader States, wrote of him with grudging admiration. He was a just prince, valiant and wise, and according to the traditions of his race, a religious man. God allowed him to prosper because our sins demanded punishment. Nur ad-Din understood something crucial. The Franks couldn't be defeated by military means alone. They had to be isolated diplomatically, strangled economically, and most importantly, deprived of the Muslim disunity that allowed them to survive. He began calling himself Al-Mujahid, the holy warrior, and made the liberation of Jerusalem his life's goal. His methods were as sophisticated as his goals. He established a network of spies in Frankish territories, often recruiting Eastern Christians resentful of Latin dominance. He reformed the tax system in his lands, reducing corruption and increasing revenue. Most cleverly, he used propaganda to tremendous effect, commissioning poems and treatises that portrayed the jihad as a religious duty. The Franks watched Nur ad-Din's rise with growing alarm. King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, young but shrewd, recognized the threat. He wrote to King Louis VII of France, "A new Saladin has arisen in the north, though he bears a different name. He unites what we have kept divided. He builds where we merely maintain." The reference to Saladin was prophetic, though Baldwin didn't know it. In Nur ad-Din's court, a young Kurdish officer named Yusuf ibn Ayyub was learning the arts of war and statecraft. The Franks would come to know him by his laqab, his honorific title, Salah ad-Din, righteousness of the faith. But Saladin's rise lay in the future. For now, Nur ad-Din methodically tightened the noose around the Crusader States. He couldn't assault them directly. Their castles were too strong, their knights too formidable in open battle. Instead, he pursued a strategy of gradual strangulation. First, he completed his father's work of unifying Syria. Damascus, which had often allied with the Franks against other Muslim powers, fell to him in 1154. The Damascenes, tired of chaos and impressed by Nur ad-Din's just rule, opened their gates without a fight. The Frankish strategy of divide and rule suffered a mortal blow. Next, he turned to economic warfare. The Crusader States depended on trade for survival. Nur ad-Din disrupted their caravan routes, making commerce dangerous and expensive. He offered better terms to Italian merchants if they traded through Muslim ports. Slowly, the lifeblood of Outremer began to ebb. His military campaigns were equally shrewd. Rather than waste men against major fortresses, he targeted isolated outposts and raided Frankish territories during harvest time. Each raid forced the Franks to maintain expensive garrisons everywhere, straining their limited manpower. The Battle of Inab in 1149 showed Nur ad-Din at his tactical best. Prince Raymond of Antioch, brave but reckless, pursued Nur ad-Din's army into a carefully prepared trap. The Frankish heavy cavalry, invincible on open ground, found themselves in broken terrain where their charge was useless. Raymond died fighting, his head sent to the Caliph in Baghdad as a trophy. But Nur ad-Din's greatest weapon was patience. He understood that time favoured the Muslims. The Frankish population wasn't growing significantly, while Muslim refugees from conquered territories swelled his cities. Every battle, even victories, cost the Franks irreplaceable knights. He could afford to wait, to probe, to wear them down. The Franks tried to counter with the Second Crusade, but that expedition, led by King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, was a disaster. Poor planning, worse execution, and Byzantine treachery led to the Crusades' failure before Damascus in 1148. The Muslim world's confidence soared. If the combined might of Europe's greatest monarchs could be defeated, what hope did the isolated Franks have? Nur ad-Din also revolutionized Muslim castle building. Learning from Frankish innovations, his fortresses began to match the Crusaders in sophistication. More worryingly for the Franks, he established a professional army paid regular salaries, reducing reliance on seasonal levies and tribal allies. But perhaps his most lasting contribution was ideological. He revived the concept of jihad not as mere warfare, but as spiritual struggle. His court produced literature portraying the conflict in cosmic terms, the forces of true faith against foreign pollution. Jerusalem, barely mentioned in early Islamic texts, became the burning heart of Muslim aspiration. The impact was profound. A Muslim merchant in Damascus told a Frankish trader, "Your grandfathers came as pilgrims and stayed as conquerors, but Nur ad-Din has reminded us that this is our land, sanctified by our prophet's night journey. What was taken by the sword will be reclaimed by the sword." By the 1160s, the strategic situation had reversed. The Crusader States, once expanding, were now contracting. Edessa was gone forever. Antioch was isolated. The kingdom of Jerusalem faced threats on every border. Only the Franks' superior castles and the military order's discipline kept total collapse at bay. Then, in 1163, a crisis in Egypt changed everything. The Fatimid Caliphate, Shia rivals to Nur ad-Din's Sunni orthodoxy, was collapsing into civil war. Both Nur ad-Din and King Amalric of Jerusalem recognized that whoever controlled Egypt's vast wealth would dominate the region. The race for Egypt would bring Saladin to prominence and set the stage for the Crusader States' greatest crisis. Nur ad-Din sent his trusted general, Shirkuh, accompanied by his nephew, Saladin. The Franks responded with their own invasions. For 6 years, Egypt became a battlefield where the future of Outremer would be decided. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the Franks breathed a sigh of relief. His son was young and weak. The Muslim coalition he had built seemed likely to fragment, but they celebrated too soon. In Egypt, Saladin had made himself sultan. He claimed to be merely Nur ad-Din's faithful servant, but everyone knew better. The student had surpassed the master. When Nur ad-Din had begun the reconquest, Saladin would complete it. The crescent was indeed ascendant, and its light would soon eclipse the cross over Jerusalem itself. The golden age of Outremer was ending. The age of Saladin was about to begin. In the scorching heat of July 1187, On a plateau called the Horns of Hattin, the fate of the Crusader kingdoms hung in the balance. King Guy of Jerusalem had led the largest army Outremer had ever fielded, stripping garrisons from every castle, leaving nothing in reserve. Across from them, Saladin commanded the united forces of Egypt and Syria. Between them lay not just a battlefield, but the culmination of decades of struggle. How had it come to this? The answer lay in the remarkable rise of Saladin and the equally remarkable folly of the Franks who faced him. Saladin was an unlikely conqueror. Born Yusuf ibn Ayyub in Tikrit, he was a Kurd in a world dominated by Turks and Arabs. His early career showed little promise of future greatness. He preferred religious studies to warfare, poetry to politics. When his uncle Shirkuh dragged him on the first expedition to Egypt, Saladin went reluctantly, but Egypt transformed him. When Shirkuh died in 1169, Saladin found himself, at barely 30 years old, vizier to the Fatimid Caliph. Within 2 years, he had abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, returning Egypt to Sunni orthodoxy and making himself sultan. It was a masterpiece of political manoeuvring that alarmed both Nur ad-Din and the Franks. Bahar ad-Din, Saladin's friend and biographer, described his transformation. In Egypt, he discovered his destiny. The pleasure-loving young man became an ascetic. The reluctant soldier became a strategist. Most remarkably, the ambitious politician became a genuine believer in jihad. This last point was crucial. While Saladin certainly enjoyed power and its privileges, he also possessed genuine religious conviction. He spent vast sums building mosques and madrasas. He lived simply, giving away so much that he died nearly penniless. Most importantly, he made the liberation of Jerusalem his life's mission, not just for political gain, but as a sacred duty. After Nur ad-Din's death in 1174, Saladin spent a decade consolidating power. He had to defeat Nur ad-Din's heirs, convince suspicious emirs of his legitimacy, and build the coalition necessary to challenge the Franks. His methods combined military pressure with generous diplomacy. Former enemies found themselves richly rewarded for switching sides. The Franks watched this consolidation with a mixture of fear and fatal overconfidence. They had survived Zengi and Nur ad-Din. Surely they could handle another Muslim warlord. Besides, they had their own strengths. The military orders were at their peak. Frankish castles seemed impregnable. The Italian cities provided steady revenue through trade. But the kingdom of Jerusalem was rotting from within. King Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King, was dying by inches. Despite his disease, he was a capable ruler who understood Saladin's threat. His sister Sibylla's marriage to Guy of Lusignan, a handsome but incompetent newcomer, created a faction that would prove disastrous. The real tragedy was Raynald of Châtillon. This former Prince of Antioch, now Lord of Kerak through marriage, was either the bravest or most foolish man in Outremer. He repeatedly broke truces with Saladin, raiding Muslim caravans and even launching a naval expedition toward Mecca itself. Each provocation gave Saladin more justification for jihad. In 1186, Raynald attacked a massive caravan, travelling from Cairo to Damascus. Among the travellers was Saladin's sister. The insult was unforgivable. Saladin swore that he would kill Raynald with his own hands, an oath that would have terrible consequences. By 1187, all the pieces were in place for catastrophe. Baldwin IV was dead. Guy of Lusignan, weak and easily influenced, wore the crown. The kingdom was split between those who wanted to maintain the truce with Saladin and hawks like Raynald who preferred war. When Saladin invaded in force, Guy faced an impossible choice. He could remain behind Jerusalem's walls and watch Saladin ravage the kingdom, or he could march out to meet him. The Templars and Raynald pushed for battle. Raymond of Tripoli, the wisest of the Frankish lords, counselled caution. Guy, as usual, chose the worst possible option. He marched out, but did so stupidly. The Frankish army, perhaps 20,000 strong, including 1,200 knights, left the springs of Sapphira on July 3rd. Their destination was Tiberias, where Saladin besieged Raymond of Tripoli's wife. It was a trap, and Raymond knew it. He begged Guy to turn back, saying he would rather lose his wife than the kingdom. Guy pressed on. The march was agony. July in Galilee is merciless, and Saladin had poisoned or blocked every water source. Muslim light cavalry harassed the column constantly, shooting arrows and retreating before the knights could respond. By nightfall, the Frankish army was desperate with thirst, still miles from the Sea of Galilee. They camped on the plateau of Hattin, near two volcanic hills called the Horns. Saladin's army surrounded them during the night. As dawn broke on July 4th, the Franks found themselves trapped, parched, and facing an enemy who held all the advantages. The battle was less a fight than a systematic destruction. Saladin had water brought up for his troops to drink, in full view of the thirsty Franks. When Guy ordered charges, the Muslim forces simply parted, let the exhausted knights through, then closed again. Frankish infantry, mad with thirst, broke ranks trying to reach the lake they could see but not reach. By afternoon it was over. The cream of Frankish nobility lay dead or captured. The true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic in the East, fell into Muslim hands. Guy and most of the great lords were prisoners. Only Raymond of Tripoli and a few others escaped the trap. Saladin's treatment of the prisoners revealed both his nobility and his ruthlessness. He received Guy and the other nobles with courtesy, offering them sherbet cooled with snow from Mount Hermon. But when Reynold of Chatillon reached for the cup, Saladin stopped him. In Arab custom, sharing food or drink meant protection. Reynold would receive no such mercy. "This man," Saladin said, "has broken every oath, violated every truce, attacked peaceful pilgrims and merchants. I swore I would kill him, and I keep my oaths." He struck off Reynold's head with his own sword, fulfilling his vow. The common knights faced varied fates. Most were enslaved, but the military orders received special treatment. Saladin offered the Templars and Hospitallers a choice: convert to Islam or die. To a man, they chose death. 200 warrior monks were executed, many by Sufi mystics, who considered it an honor to kill these Christian equivalents. With the kingdom's army destroyed, Saladin swept through the Frankish lands like a cleansing fire. Castle after castle surrendered, their garrisons gone. Cities opened their gates, hoping for mercy. Within weeks, only a handful of strongholds remained in Christian hands. Jerusalem itself held out until September. The city was packed with refugees, but had few defenders. Balian of Ibelin, one of the few lords to survive Hattin, led the defence. He knighted every noble boy over 16, and even commoners, desperate to create some kind of fighting force. But everyone knew the end was inevitable. After a brief siege, Balian negotiated surrender. The contrast with the Frankish conquest of 1099 was stark. Saladin allowed the Christian population to leave peacefully, paying ransom for their freedom. Those who couldn't pay were enslaved, but there was no massacre, no burning of religious sites. On October 2nd, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. His first act was to purify the Al-Aqsa Mosque, washing away decades of Christian occupation with rosewater. The cross atop the dome of the rock was pulled down as his soldiers cried, "Allahu Akbar!" For the first time in 88 years, the call to prayer echoed over the holy city. The Christian world reeled in shock. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing the news. The call went out for a new crusade, the third, which would bring the legendary kings of Europe to the east. But the kingdom of Jerusalem, as it had existed, was dead. Yet Saladin's victory was not complete. Tyre, under the inspired leadership of Conrad of Montferrat, held out. This single city would become the seedbed for Frankish recovery. The military orders castles, built to withstand years of siege, proved their worth. Crac des Chevaliers and other fortresses remained defiant islands in the Muslim Sea. More surprisingly, Saladin's very mercy created problems. By allowing the Frankish nobility to ransom themselves, he ensured they would return to fight another day. His chivalrous treatment of enemies won him admiration even among Christians, but it also meant the Crusader States, though mortally wounded, were not yet dead. As 1187 ended, Saladin controlled most of the former Crusader territories, but holding them would prove as challenging as taking them. The Third Crusade was coming, bringing Richard the Lionheart and other legendary warriors. The struggle for the Holy Land was entering a new phase. Hattin had changed everything. The age of Crusader expansion was over forever. From now on, the Franks would be fighting not to grow, but merely to survive. The dream of Outremer had become a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. But history is never simple. Even in defeat, the Crusader ideal evolved and endured. The cross and crescent would continue their deadly dance for another century, though the music had fundamentally changed. The news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe like a thunderclap from a clear sky. In Paris, in London, in Rome, people wept openly in the streets. Churches held continuous masses. Knights who had never considered crusading suddenly burned to take the cross. The disaster at Hattin had done what decades of papal preaching couldn't. It had united Western Christendom in a single purpose. But unity of purpose didn't mean unity of action. The Third Crusade, launched with such fervor, would become a case study in how personality, politics, and pride could undermine even the holiest of causes. 3 of Europe's greatest monarchs took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, the aging Holy Roman Emperor, commanded the respect due to his years and victories. Philip Augustus of France, young and cunning, saw the Crusade as a chance to eclipse his rivals. Richard of England, called the Lionheart, brought legendary military skill matched only by his legendary temper. Frederick never reached the Holy Land. In June 1190, the 70-year-old emperor drowned crossing a river in Anatolia. His army, the largest and best organised, melted away. Some returned home, others pressed on, arriving in Acre as a shadow of their former strength. The Germans pickled their emperor's body in vinegar, hoping to bury him in Jerusalem, but even his corpse never reached the Holy City. This left Philip and Richard, who hated each other with the passion only former friends can muster. They had once been close, some whispered too close. Now they were rivals in everything: glory, territory, and the claim to lead Christendom's revenge. They arrived at Acre in 1191 to find the siege already underway. Guy of Lusignan, released by Saladin in a moment of either mercy or cunning, had begun the siege 2 years earlier. It had become a stalemate, a miniature war where Christian and Muslim camps faced each other in elaborate entrenchments. Richard's arrival changed everything. His reputation preceded him. The warrior who had conquered Cyprus en route, who fought like a demon and commanded like a genius. The Muslim chronicler Bahar ad-Din described watching him. This red-haired Frank fought at the head of his men, his sword never still. Our warriors fled before him like sheep before a lion. But Richard was more than a warrior. He understood siege warfare, logistics, and most importantly, how to inspire men. Under his leadership, Acre's walls finally crumbled. On July 12, 1191, the city surrendered. What followed tarnished Richard's reputation forever. When Saladin delayed paying ransom for the garrison, Richard ordered 2,700 Muslim prisoners executed in full view of Saladin's army. It was a calculated atrocity, meant to show that the Lionheart could match Saladin's mercy with ruthlessness. Philip Augustus, claiming illness, abandoned the crusade after Acre's fall. His real motivation was transparent. With Richard absent, he could attack English holdings in France. The Third Crusade's unity shattered before it properly began. This left Richard and Saladin to dance their deadly duet along the Palestinian coast. For over a year, they fought a war of movement and maneuver that became the stuff of legend. Richard won every battle, but couldn't translate tactical victory into strategic success. Saladin lost every encounter, but kept his army intact and Jerusalem secure. The Battle of Arsuf in September 1191 showcased both commanders at their best. Saladin harassed Richard's army, marching south along the coast, trying to provoke a premature charge. Richard held his men in iron discipline until the perfect moment, then unleashed a devastating counterattack that shattered the Muslim forces. But what good were victories if they led nowhere? Richard marched to within sight of Jerusalem twice, but never attacked. He knew that even if he took the city, he couldn't hold it once he returned to Europe. The Kingdom of Jerusalem needed a permanent solution, not a glorious gesture. The two great adversaries never met face to face, but they developed a peculiar respect. They exchanged gifts and messages. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent his personal physician and snow from Mount Hermon to cool his fever. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 replacements, saying a warrior of his caliber should not fight on foot. Their correspondence, preserved by both Christian and Muslim chroniclers, reveals complex men trapped by their roles. Richard wrote, "Jerusalem is as holy to you as to us, perhaps more so. But it was our city first, and we cannot abandon it." Saladin replied, "Jerusalem is indeed holy to us. It is where our prophet made his night journey to heaven. We cannot give it up either, especially after God has granted us victory." By autumn 1192, both men were exhausted. Richard faced rebellion in England and French attacks on his continental lands. Saladin's emirs were tired of constant war, his treasury empty. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September, was a compromise that satisfied no one, but perhaps reflected reality. The Crusaders kept a strip of coast from Tyre to Jaffa. Christian pilgrims could visit Jerusalem freely, but the city remained under Muslim control. The Kingdom of Jerusalem survived, but as a pale shadow centered on Acre. Both sides claimed victory, both knew better. Richard left the Holy Land in October 1192, never to return. Legend says he wept as the coast disappeared, vowing to come back and finish God's work. But his tears might have been for what he had learned, that courage and skill weren't enough, that the Crusades had become a conflict neither side could truly win. Saladin outlived his great rival by only 5 months, dying in March 1193. He left 17 dinars in his treasury, having given away a fortune in charity. His sons immediately fell to fighting over his empire, undoing much of his life's work. The Muslim unity that had reclaimed Jerusalem fragmented once more. The Third Crusade's aftermath established a pattern that would persist for another century. The Crusader States, reduced to a coastal rump, survived through Italian naval power, divisions among Muslim successors, and occasional reinforcements from Europe. They became increasingly commercial rather than religious enterprises, trading ports that happened to fly the cross. New crusades would come. The fourth would infamously sack Constantinople instead of fighting Muslims. The fifth would invade Egypt and fail. The sixth would see Frederick II, the excommunicated emperor, negotiate Jerusalem's return, without fighting, only to lose it again 15 years later. Each expedition seemed smaller, more cynical, further from the pure zeal of Urban's call at Clermont. The military orders evolved too, becoming international corporations as much as religious brotherhoods. The Templars' banking network spanned from London to Jerusalem. The Hospitallers governed roads like merchant princes. The Teutonic Knights abandoned the Holy Land entirely, crusading against Baltic pagans instead. In Acre, the capital of what remained, a strange society flourished. Frankish nobles intermarried with Armenian and Byzantine Christians, creating a mixed aristocracy. Italian merchants dominated commerce. The military orders maintained their headquarters in massive compounds that were cities within the city. It was prosperous, cosmopolitan, and ultimately doomed. The end came from an unexpected direction. In 1260, Mongol armies shattered the divided Muslim states. For a brief moment, some crusaders dreamed of alliance with these pagan conquerors against Islam. But at Ain Jalut in 1260, the Mamluks of Egypt crushed the Mongols and emerged as the dominant power. The Mamluks were something new, slave soldiers who had overthrown their masters and created their own state. They were professional warriors with no romantic notions about chivalry or coexistence. Under leaders like Baybars and Kalawun, they methodically reduced Crusader strongholds. Baybars, who claimed to be Saladin's heir, showed none of his predecessors mercy. When Antioch fell in 1268, he ordered every Christian killed or enslaved. The city that had been a Crusader principality for 170 years was erased. Other cities received the same treatment. By 1290, only Acre remained as a significant Crusader holding. The city was wealthy but hopelessly divided. The military orders fought each other in the streets. Italian communities waged commercial wars. The titular king of Jerusalem lived in Cyprus, visiting occasionally to remind everyone of his irrelevance. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil Kalawun's son began the final siege in April 1291. The defenders fought magnificently. The Templars and Hospitallers forgot their rivalries. Common citizens took up arms, but there would be no miraculous relief this time. On May 18th, the walls were breached. The last stand of the Templars in their great tower became legend. They fought for 10 more days after the city fell, finally dying when the undermined tower collapsed on defenders and attackers alike. It was a fitting end. The military orders, who had done so much to sustain the Crusader States, perished with them. Some escaped by ship to Cyprus, where the Kingdom of Jerusalem maintained a ghostly existence for centuries. Others returned to Europe with tales of horror and heroism, but Outremer, the great experiment in colonial Christianity, was dead. The dream that had begun at Clermont in 1095 ended in the rubble of Acre in 1291. Nearly 200 years of war, coexistence, cultural exchange, and bitter hatred had come to this. The cross would never again fly over Jerusalem's walls. The age of crusading, at least to the Holy Land, was over, but its echoes would resonate through centuries, shaping how East and West saw each other, creating myths and memories that still influence our world today. In the year 1300, a Venetian merchant named Marco Polo returned from the East with tales that amazed Europe. He had travelled through lands once fought over by Crusaders and Muslims, finding them now under Mongol rule. In his accounts, the great religious war that had consumed so many lives already seemed like ancient history. Yet its shadows were lengthening, not fading, reaching forward through time in ways no one could have predicted. The Crusades had ended, but crusading had not. Like a virus mutating to survive, the idea adapted to new conditions and new enemies. If Muslims in the Holy Land could no longer be fought, there were pagans in the Baltic, heretics in France, political enemies of the Pope in Italy. The cross that had once pointed toward Jerusalem now turned in every direction. In Languedoc, the prosperous region of southern France, a different kind of crusade unfolded. The Cathars, Christians who believed in a dualist universe of good and evil, had flourished under tolerant local nobles. To the church, they were a cancer that threatened Christianity from within. Pope Innocent III, the same pope who had launched the disastrous Fourth Crusade, called for their destruction. The Albigensian Crusade, beginning in 1209, showed how the machinery of holy war could be turned against fellow Christians. When the Crusaders besieged Béziers and asked how to distinguish Catholics from Cathars, the papal legate supposedly replied, "Kill them all. God will know his own." 20,000 died in Béziers alone. The wealth and culture of Languedoc, which had produced troubadours and poetry, was systematically destroyed. Northern French nobles, led by Simon de Montfort, seized southern lands in the name of orthodoxy. It was conquest disguised as theology, showing how the crusading ideal had curdled into something darker. Meanwhile, in the frozen forests of the Baltic, another transformation was underway. The Teutonic Knights, originally founded to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, had found new purpose fighting pagan Prussians and Lithuanians. They created a monastic military state, building castles that looked like those in Outremer but stood among pine trees instead of palm. This northern crusade lasted centuries, long after everyone had forgotten Jerusalem. The knights converted pagans at sword point, German settlers followed, and entire cultures vanished. When there were no more pagans to fight, the knights fought Orthodox Russians and Catholic Poles. The ideal of religious war had become mere territorial expansion. In Iberia, the Reconquista continued its centuries-long march. Spanish and Portuguese knights, inspired by crusading ideology, pushed Muslim kingdoms ever southward. When Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, fell in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed for the Americas, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand celebrated by expelling all Jews and Muslims who wouldn't convert. The Spanish Inquisition, born from this triumph, showed another dark evolution of crusading thought. The enemy was no longer external, but internal. False converts, secret Jews, hidden Muslims. The techniques of religious war turned inward, creating a surveillance state that would last centuries. But perhaps the strangest afterlife of the Crusades was how they lived on in Muslim memory. For medieval Muslims, the Crusades had been one conflict among many, often less important than struggles with Mongols or internal divisions. But as European power grew in later centuries, Muslim intellectuals began reinterpreting the Crusades as the first chapter in a longer story of Western aggression. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he claimed to come as a liberator, even declaring himself a friend of Islam. But Egyptian chroniclers saw him as a new crusader, linking his invasion to those of Louis IX centuries earlier. The past was being rewritten to explain the present. This reinterpretation accelerated during the colonial period. As Britain and France carved up the Ottoman Empire after World War I, Arab nationalists invoked Saladin and the victory at Hattin. The Crusades became a metaphor for Western imperialism, their memory weaponized for modern politics. When General Allenby entered Jerusalem in 1917, ending Ottoman rule, he supposedly declared, "Today the Crusades have ended." He almost certainly never said this, but the myth spread because it felt true to both sides. For Arabs, it confirmed their fears. For Europeans, it satisfied old dreams. The foundation of Israel, in 1948, added new layers to this historical palimpsest. Some Arab leaders explicitly compared Zionism to the Crusader States, foreign implants that would eventually be expelled. The fact that the Crusader kingdom had lasted nearly 200 years was conveniently forgotten. In the West, the Crusades underwent their own mythological transformation. Sir Walter Scott's novels painted them as chivalrous adventures. Victorian historians saw them as bringing civilization to barbarous lands. Hollywood made them into epic romances where noble knights fought for God and glory. These popular images bore little resemblance to historical reality, but shaped how millions understood the past. The complex world of Outremer, where Franks and Muslims often lived peacefully, disappeared. The pragmatic truces and cultural exchanges were forgotten. Only the clash of civilizations remained. The rise of modern Islamist movements brought new relevance to crusading memory. Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian thinker whose writings inspired Al-Qaeda, wrote extensively about the Crusades as an ongoing war against Islam. Osama bin Laden called Americans Crusaders, collapsing 1,000 years of history into a single, eternal conflict. When President George W. Bush inadvertently used the word crusade to describe the war on terror after September 11th, 2001, the reaction in the Muslim world was electric. A single word carried centuries of historical weight, proving how the past never truly dies. Yet this politicized memory obscures as much as it reveals. The real Crusades were far more complex than any modern parallel suggests. They were wars of religion, but also of economics, politics, and personal ambition. They produced horror, but also exchange, destruction, but also creation. The Kingdom of Jerusalem's legal codes influenced European law. Arabic numerals and algebra came west partly through Crusader contacts. Medieval Europe's rediscovery of Aristotle happened through Arabic translations encountered in Outremer and Spain. The pointed arch foundation of Gothic architecture was borrowed from Muslim builders. Even the ideal of chivalry, so associated with crusading knights, owed much to Islamic models. The Arabic word furusiyya, meaning horsemanship, and its associated virtues, influenced European concepts of knightly behaviour. Saladin became a chivalric hero in European literature, his courtesy and honour held up as examples for Christian knights. The military orders left their own complex legacy. The Templars, dissolved in 1307 amid charges of heresy, became the subject of endless conspiracy theories. The Hospitallers survived as the Knights of Malta, evolving from warriors to medics to a sovereign curiosity. The Teutonic Knights state became Prussia, eventually the core of modern Germany. Modern international law owes debts to crusading era innovations. The concept of non-combatant immunity, laws governing truces, even early forms of international arbitration, developed partly from the need to regulate warfare between Crusader states and their Muslim neighbours. The Crusades also accelerated Europe's economic development. Italian cities grew rich financing and supplying expeditions. Banking innovations, including letters of credit, developed to handle crusading finances. The need to pay for crusades drove taxation reforms that strengthened European states. But perhaps the deepest legacy is psychological. The Crusades created a template for sacred violence that has proven terrifyingly durable. When any cause becomes holy, when enemies become infidels, when compromise becomes apostasy, we see the crusading spirit reborn. This spirit appears in secular forms too. Revolutionary France's wars to spread liberty, communist campaigns against class enemies, even democratic crusades to remake the world, all echo that first call at Clermont. The specific religious content changes, but the underlying pattern remains. We are good, they are evil. Violence in service of the good is blessed. Yet there were always those who questioned this logic. Francis of Assisi, visiting the Crusader camp at Damietta in 1219, tried to convert the Sultan through peaceful preaching rather than violence. Roger Bacon argued that Muslims would be won by reason, not swords. Ramon Lull spent his life developing dialogue between faiths. These voices were minorities in their time, but point toward different possibilities. The same era that produced Crusades also produced Thomas Aquinas reading Averroes, Jewish philosophers influencing Christian thought, and moments of genuine cultural synthesis. The tragedy of the Crusades is not just the blood spilled, but the opportunities missed. What might have happened if the energy devoted to conquest had been channeled into exchange? If the wealth spent on castles had built universities? If the courage shown in battle had been matched by courage in understanding? These questions have no answers because history allows no second chances. The Crusades happened as they happened, leaving us with their complex legacy of glory and shame, achievement and atrocity, faith and fanaticism. In Jerusalem today, you can still see Crusader churches standing next to mosques, their stones bearing witness to centuries of conflict and coexistence. The city that was fought over so bitterly remains divided, still holy to three faiths, still a flashpoint where past and present collide. The Crusades ended 7 centuries ago, but in a sense, they never ended at all. Every time religion and violence mix, every time cultural difference becomes grounds for war, every time we divide the world into us and them, the ghost of Pope Urban's speech echoes across the years. Understanding this history matters, not because it provides easy lessons, but because it warns against easy answers. The Crusaders were neither simple heroes nor simple villains. They were human beings caught up in forces beyond their control, making choices that seemed right at the time and living with consequences they never imagined. Their story is our story, whether we recognize it or not. In their faith and their failures, their dreams and their disasters, we see reflections of our own age, reminders that the past is never as distant as we think. Here in the quiet hours where history meets memory, we reach the end of our journey through time. We have walked the blood-soaked roads from Clermont to Jerusalem, from Antioch's mighty walls to Acre's final flames. We have seen empires rise and fall, watched faiths clash, and sometimes, remarkably, coexist. The Crusades, that great convulsion that shook 3 continents for 2 centuries, have finally fallen silent. Or have they? As I speak these words to you across the centuries, from my time to yours, I wonder what echoes you still hear. History never truly ends. It only transforms, like energy that cannot be destroyed, only changed from one form to another. The knights are gone. The castles stand empty, but the ideas they fought for, the passions that drove them, the fears that consumed them, these live on in different guises. We began with Pope Urban II, standing before that crowd in Clermont, unleashing forces he could never have imagined. How strange that a single speech, delivered on a cold November morning in 1095, could reshape the world so profoundly. Urban thought he was launching a military expedition. He was actually opening a door between civilizations that could never be fully closed again. Through that door passed warriors and pilgrims, merchants and scholars, saints and sinners. Each carried their own dreams, their own demons. The knight seeking salvation through his sword, the younger son hoping for lands of his own, the merchant calculating profits in bezants and dinars, the pilgrim wanting only to pray where Christ had walked, all of them swept up in something larger than themselves. We have seen how the First Crusades' unlikely success created the Crusader States, those fascinating hybrid societies where East met West in ways both beautiful and terrible. In the markets of Acre, in the halls of Jerusalem, in the shadow of great castles like Crac de Chevalier, a new world briefly flowered. It was a world of contradictions, where the same knights who had massacred thousands might sit down to dinner with Muslim neighbours, where Arabic poetry influenced French troubadours, where Byzantine mosaics decorated Latin churches. That world died at Hattin, on that terrible July day, when Saladin's victory shattered the illusion of Frankish invincibility. Yet even in defeat, something endured. The Third Crusade brought Richard and Saladin together in a dance of war and mutual respect that still captures our imagination. 2 great leaders, each trapped by the expectations of their followers, fighting a war neither could truly win. The later Crusades showed how ideals decay. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople, Christians destroying the greatest Christian city, revealed how completely the original vision had been corrupted. The Albigensian Crusade turned holy war inward, making heretics of neighbours. The Baltic Crusades continued for centuries after everyone had forgotten why they started. And through it all, ordinary people lived and died, loved and lost, tried to make sense of a world torn apart by faith and ambition. The Muslim farmer watching Frankish knights ride past his fields. The Eastern Christian caught between two versions of his own religion. The Jewish communities destroyed for the crime of being different. The Italian merchant growing rich on war while preaching peace. What can we learn from their stories? Perhaps that human beings are capable of both transcendent faith and appalling cruelty, sometimes in the same breath. That ideas powerful enough to move mountains are also powerful enough to destroy them. That the line between sacred devotion and destructive fanaticism is thinner than we like to believe. The Crusades remind us that history is not a moral fable with clear heroes and villains. The same crusader who committed atrocities might also show remarkable courage and loyalty. The same Muslim leader who called for jihad might also demonstrate tolerance and wisdom. People are complicated, their motivations mixed, their actions unpredictable. They also remind us that unintended consequences often outweigh intended ones. Urban II wanted to reclaim Jerusalem and unite Christendom. He achieved the first temporarily, failed at the second permanently. The Crusades widened the split between Eastern and Western Christianity, introduced Europe to Arabic learning, revolutionized castle building, transformed banking, and created myths that still shape how civilizations see each other. None of this was planned. History unfolds not according to human design, but through the collision of countless individual choices, each person acting on incomplete information, driven by hopes and fears they barely understand themselves. The knight taking the cross at Clermont had no idea his decision would echo through centuries. He was just trying to save his soul. In the end, perhaps that's the most human truth the Crusades teach us. Behind all the grand narratives of faith and conquest, beneath the clash of civilizations and the rise and fall of kingdoms, were individual human beings trying to make sense of their lives, seeking meaning in an uncertain world. The Crusader praying in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, tears streaming down his face, having travelled 3,000 miles and seen friends die horrible deaths, finally standing by where his Saviour stood. The Muslim defender of Jerusalem, watching the Frankish banners approach, knowing his family's fate depends on his courage. The Jewish scholar in Rhineland, hearing the mob approach, making an impossible choice between conversion and death. Each of them was as real as you or I, as full of dreams and doubts, as capable of nobility and failure. They lived in different times, believed different things, but they shared the same human heart that beats in your chest. As you listen to these words. And now, as night deepens and our journey through time comes to its close, I leave you with a final thought. The Crusades ended 700 years ago, but the questions they raised remain. How do we live with difference? When does faith become fanaticism? Can sacred ends justify violent means? What happens when worldviews collide? These are not medieval questions. They are eternal questions, as relevant in your time as they were in the time of Saladin and Richard, Urban and Alexios, Godfrey and Zengi. The costumes change, the weapons evolve, but the human drama continues. May you find wisdom in these ancient stories. May you see in them not just distant history, but mirrors of our own time, warnings and inspirations for the choices we face. And may you remember that history is not something that happened to other people long ago. It is the story we're all writing together, one choice at a time. The dust of the Crusades has long since settled, but new dust is always rising. What banners will be raised in your time? What causes will seem worth dying for? What dreams will drive people to extraordinary acts of courage or cruelty? The future is unwritten, but the past whispers its lessons to those who will listen. And so, dear listener, as you drift towards sleep or return to your daily tasks, carry with you the echoes of these ancient struggles. Remember that you too are part of history's great tapestry, your thread woven among billions of others, creating patterns whose meaning only time will reveal. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the centuries. If these stories have moved you, if they've made you think or question or wonder, then perhaps share them with others. Like and subscribe, as they say in your time, but more importantly, remember and reflect. The Crusades are over, the castles stand empty, the warriors sleep beneath their stone effigies, but their story, our story, the human story, continues. May you write your chapter well. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful.